It was a Monday evening in 2013 in Kirkland, Washington, and a man was driving an SUV with his parents in the car when he was struck by a runaway bus. The man with a concussion and a fractured rib called 911. He told the dispatcher that he'd been hit, that his mother was badly injured, and that his father was possibly already dead. As it turned out, that driver tragically lost both of his parents that night. So began the long and difficult fight for answers and justice. In your everyday life, you may see these stories on the evening news. Maybe you see a headline in the local paper. Hopefully, you never have to actually live or experience anything like it. But to the individuals involved, their loved ones, and the people fighting for them, each and every one of these collisions represents one of the most horrific and challenging times in their lives. We share their stories and break down the legal battles and recovery that comes later on this episode of the True Claims podcast. Hello, everybody. I'm Eric Johnson, and I spent a long career as a television news journalist. And we saw so many stories come through, tragedies like the one we're going to talk about today. But rarely did we go behind the scenes and follow the stories all the way into the courtroom or into the negotiations that followed. We're going to do that today, give you a behind-the-scenes look at how this particular case played out. Chris Davis of the Davis Law Group is going to join us. He represented the man in that SUV on that fateful evening in Kirkland, Washington. But first, a few more facts about this situation, this tragedy that played out. The man driving with his parents entered an intersection. The light was green. He had only a split second to recognize the speed of the bus that was flying through the intersection before impact. The man's father died in the SUV. His mother died later at the hospital, and he was left to pick up the pieces and search for answers. The bus driver claimed that there was a mechanical failure, that his brakes didn't work, but it would take time for the truth to come to light and for the man who was driving the car to somehow try to recover. Joining me now is Chris Davis of the Davis Law Group. Welcome, Chris. Let's talk about this case. That man in the SUV reached out to you for representation. What were your first thoughts when you heard this story?
Well, I was pretty shocked and surprised because it involved a Sound Transit bus. We see these buses all over on our streets and highways. And I was also pretty surprised and very sympathetic because the man was taking his two elderly parents home when the accident happened, and both of his parents tragically died in that collision.
Any other details you can tell us about the case? This bus was traveling fast, wasn't it?
Right. So, yeah, it was a Sound Transit bus, and he was exiting Interstate 405 and was traveling in the on-ramp, which was at an incline. And we know from the bus camera inside that he had a red light, which was visible about 1,000 feet away from the intersection. And for some reason, he did not slow down, took no corrective action, but went through that red light at the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit.
Wow.
So he and his attorneys and the insurance company argued that there was brake failure. So our investigation found out that that was not true. The brakes had worked just fine. So for some reason, he had essentially blanked out. We don't know, but ran through that red light without ever slowing down.
Wow. Chris, in a case like this involving a bus or a transit vehicle, how is that different from your standpoint as you start to look at this than if it were just a regular passenger vehicle?
Yeah, so it involved a bus which is defined under the law as a commercial vehicle, and there are separate federal laws and state laws and regulations that apply to the operation of a commercial vehicle. So you have to be well versed in those laws. You also have to be very prepared to do an immediate investigation because the bus companies will have an army of lawyers and experts. Typically, many of them will arrive on the scene of the accident on that day to perform their own investigation and start a defense to protect their driver. So we had to be prepared to launch our investigation immediately just to make sure that none of the evidence was being lost or destroyed or tampered with.
So in a situation like this, there were cameras. We could visually see what happened. There was no mystery about what happened. So how do you go about finding out who was at fault here, especially when you're talking about commercial insurance for the transit company, right? They're fully loaded with insurance.
Right. So, well, as I said before, one of the defenses that they were arguing was brake failure. And brake failure was a potential defense that could have relieved the bus company from all responsibility. So we hired a truck and bus mechanic to inspect the brakes to make sure that the brakes were in proper working order, and we found that they were. The bus camera was very pivotal evidence because it showed that the bus driver had more than sufficient distance to slow the bus down and stop at the red light. So then the question became, okay, what was going on with the bus driver to cause him to never slow down and run through this red light at 55 miles per hour? And I took his deposition, which is a sworn statement where I get to ask him questions under oath, just like he was in a court of law. And he really had no explanation for why he did what he did. And the best that I could gather is that if he essentially just zoned out while he was driving. I think perhaps he may have been tired or fatigued. I think he told me he only got 4 or 5 hours of sleep the night before. So those factors lead me to believe that he might have been tired, he might have zoned out, and simply just didn't notice the red light when he ran through it.
And yet he said that his brakes failed, and you proved that that wasn't the case. Is that in itself criminal behavior?
Unfortunately, no. So when it comes to criminal behavior, you really have to show that somebody intended to kill somebody or intended to hurt somebody. So the best that we could do was to show that he was negligent, which basically means that he was careless. He failed to follow the rules of the road. I believe the state and the county investigated criminal charges and determined there just wasn't enough evidence to charge him criminally.
He wasn't impaired in any way other than maybe being tired.
Yeah, no impairment. The only evidence I had was that he was probably fatigued.
It seems in some ways cut and dry, and yet you're dealing with a major insurance company, a commercial insurance, and they don't like to dole out money regardless of the evidence at hand, right?
Oh, absolutely. So when we deal with commercial cases and bus accident cases, there's usually plenty of insurance. And paradoxically, the more that there's insurance, typically insurance companies will fight harder in those claims. Why? Because there's more money under the policy to save. And so this case was no different. There was, I think, a $20 or $30 million commercial policy that covered the loss, but the bus company was very aggressive in defending the claim, and they also took the common argument when we're dealing with people who are older that die. The common argument that I get is that, they only had a few years of life left anyways, therefore their wrongful death claims aren't worth that much.
They really say that.
They really do say that. Now, they won't say it in front of a jury. They'll try to imply it, but they'll tell me over the telephone, your wrongful death person is, in his 80s. The lifespan of an 85-year-old is maybe another 3 or 4 years. Therefore, this case is minor, and we should only pay out maybe a few $100,000. So
I would argue that if you only have a few more years to live, that time that you have left is all the more precious, not the other way around.
And that's the counter argument that I always make. And so usually, and I stick to that, and usually I usually win that argument. So ultimately, I'm able to get usually many millions of dollars in a case like this, even when the people that are killed are elderly.
That bus was traveling 55 miles an hour as that SUV pulled in to that intersection with a green light. What kind of damage, I hate to even ask this question, does a vehicle that large do to an SUV when it crushes into it?
Well, no question, it's catastrophic. The driver, the elderly son that was driving his parents, and they were in the back seat, by the way, he was lucky because the bus had hit the rear portion of the vehicle. Had the bus maybe been a few feet to the front of the vehicle, then the driver, the elderly son, would likely have been killed as well, and we would have had a 3-fatality collision on our hands.
Certainly the police show up at a situation like this. They do their own investigation separately of you, or do you work in tandem with the police on a situation like this? How does that play out?
So oftentimes we'll work in tandem with the police. We have our own investigation team, and our team will usually contact the police, ask for their records, measurements, photographs, and so forth. And a lot of times our team will supplement the investigation that is done by the State Patrol or the county police. Sometimes we're able to come up with evidence that the police overlooks or misses that can strengthen the case. So that happens quite frequently.
You mentioned that there were no criminal charges for the driver, even though he said that he had tried to apply the brakes when in fact the brakes were working. But what would criminal charges, if there were criminal charges, how would that change the way you will go about your case?
So the criminal charges they're handled by the prosecuting attorney, and it's a separate case from the civil claim. So we do not bring criminal charges. We would work hand in hand with the prosecuting attorney on prosecuting the case. But oftentimes when there are criminal charges, there are additional resources that the government will expend in investigating the case, preparing the case for trial, and oftentimes that will work to our advantage for our clients in the civil arena when we are prosecuting the case civilly. And by civil, it means we are requesting monetary damages for the harms that have been caused.
So now the police have their investigation. You're doing your own investigation and working in tandem with them. What other things do you look at? So we had cameras. We saw visually what happened. Cameras on the bus, it sounds like. What else are you looking at in this situation?
So we certainly are looking for witnesses, eyewitnesses. We're looking for other cameras in the area. Sometimes there are businesses that have surveillance cameras. We're looking for physical evidence at the scene, skid marks, traction marks. We're looking at the damage to the vehicle. So typically I'll hire an accident reconstruction expert that'll look at the damage to come up with velocity, force, speed, etc., to really help us explain the dynamics of the collision and how it occurred. We're also investigating the driver. Does the driver have a criminal record? Did the driver have any sort of medical issue going on? If a medical defense is being asserted, we'll seek copies of the driver's medical history and records to explore that avenue. Those are just a few examples of the things that we're looking at in our investigation.
You mentioned that there was a deposition of the driver. Were you able to question him, and what do those look like? Is it like the movies? Is it like we imagine it?
So yeah, the deposition is a sworn question and answer session, and the driver is put under oath just like he would be if he were in a courtroom, and I'm able to ask him questions under oath. And most depositions are quite boring. It's usually fact gathering, but there are moments where it can be pretty dramatic. Sometimes I'm able to catch a person in a lie and confront the person. If I'm able to do that, oftentimes that might enhance the value of the case. If I can show that the defendant is not credible or a liar, then usually the insurance company is going to pay more money to settle that claim because they don't want their person to be seen by a jury. So.
Okay, let's get into this then, the actual settlement and the investigation that led to, how did that play out? Did it play out in your favor? Tell me the components of that.
So after we perform our investigation and we gather all of the evidence, then I'll hire experts to help us address certain issues in the case. For instance, one of the issues in a wrongful death case is whether the person experienced pre-death pain and suffering or fear. So sometimes I'll hire a pathologist or an ER doctor to opine on that particular issue. After we get all the expert opinions and the evidence, we put together a comprehensive settlement package, and we'll send it off to the insurance company with a demand. And the demand I rely on similar cases, cases that I've handled, cases that other attorneys have handled. I'll look at certain aggravating circumstances in the case. For instance, you mentioned the fact that these are elderly people. They only had a few years left. That would be an aggravating factor that I would argue. That's why their claims are worth more than a typical claim. And then there's the process of the insurance company responding to the demand, and there's a negotiation period. Sometimes the negotiations can be handled in one phone call. More often than not, it takes many phone calls over many weeks, sometimes months. In this particular case, because we filed a lawsuit, there was an actual mediation where we go before a mediator who is a disinterested person who helps the parties reach a settlement. And oftentimes the mediator will go back and forth between the rooms and point out strengths and weaknesses in each side's position and hopefully get the parties to come together to meet somewhere in the middle at an appropriate amount to settle the case.
So this case did not go to trial. The negotiation was successful.
Right.
Did you feel good about it? Did your client feel good about it?
I felt very, very good about it. And something the public needs to understand is that, the insurance companies, they only pay good settlements if the lawyer you hire has a reputation of going to trial. And that's because if the lawyer can try the case in court and actually get a bigger verdict than the insurance company wants, then the insurance company will pay a higher settlement to settle that case. So most personal injury attorneys that you see on TV, for instance, they never go to trial. They've never seen the inside of a courtroom. And so usually those attorneys are not able to command high settlement value on their cases. So I've taken a different tactic. So I usually go to trial once every 12 to 24 months. And that's important because it gives me credibility when I say to the insurance company, if you don't pay me this amount, we're going to try the case and we're going to get a much bigger verdict. And because I have that credibility, the insurance company usually will pay up and settle what I feel is fair for my clients.
And that's the way it played out.
That's the way it played out.
What can we learn from this case? I mean, it's such a horrifying story. Yeah. And yet we all go through multiple intersections every day. We trust that the bus coming down the road isn't going to crash 55 miles an hour into that intersection. What's our takeaway with, traffic that we all deal with, buses that we all deal with, and human carnage and human life, and this chance that we take every time we get into a car?
Yeah, I've been in the unique position over the last 30 years to see some pretty horrible stuff. And I would say this: life is precious, and you just never know what can happen. Things can change on a dime, in an instant, when you least expect it. I've seen some very tragic cases, innocent people following the law, and then all of a sudden they're creamed by somebody who runs a stop sign or runs a red light, and they're dead. So the first thing would be appreciate your family, tell them that you love them, appreciate life, understand that life does not last, and be grateful. Second of all, I would tell people when they're out on our roads, you need to drive defensively. You need to anticipate the worst. Before you go through that green light, take an extra second or two to look left and right just to make sure nobody's running a red light. Little things like that might be able to save your life one day, or the lives of your family members.
Having seen as much as you've seen, all that rings true coming from you. And then, of course, how would you tell people they should go about hiring an attorney? God forbid something bad happens. Hopefully nothing even remotely close to what happened in this particular case. But you've written a book about what to do and how to go about the process of hiring an attorney, because it's important. You know that.
Absolutely. The attorney that you hire can add hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of dollars extra to your claim. So you definitely want an attorney that is experienced. I used to think, after 15 or 20 years, I had enough experience to do everything well. Now I've got 30 years, and I know that isn't true. So 30 years is a hell of a lot better than 20 years. Yeah. So for the more serious cases, the death cases, the catastrophic injury cases, you should hire a very experienced attorney that only handles your type of case. And you should take your time and do your research on the attorney. Look at their reviews online. Do some research with the bar, for instance. Look at their case results. Ask around. Ask friends and family of names of attorneys. Really do your due diligence on a lawyer before you decide to hire that person, because once you hire that person, odds are you'll be working with that attorney for 1, 2, 3, 4 years or more until the claim resolves. So you want to be able to trust that attorney, you want to get along with that attorney, and you want to make sure that the attorney is experienced and capable to do the best job that he or she can for you.
And then how about immediately after an accident? You're in a fender bender of some sort, or a bad accident. before you have an attorney, there are certain things you need to do or need to know to do, even in the moment, right, amidst all the chaos of an accident.
Right. So most fender benders, they don't need the assistance of an attorney. Those are claims you can probably handle on your own. But it's important, one, to get the other driver's insurance information, a copy of the driver's license, take photographs of the damage at the scene, take photographs of where the cars are at the time of the accident. I can't tell you how often we get a client that comes in and says the accident happened this way, and then all of a sudden we hear back from the other driver who says it happened a different way. So make sure you call the police. The police will come and they'll record the statements of both drivers. They'll make a record, a permanent record of what happened, so the other driver can't change his or her story. Those are bare essentials that everyone must do to protect themselves.
So you went back to this case, you went through the negotiation. Can you give us any idea how it came out for the man that was involved in that horrific accident? What kind of compensation did he receive?
So what I can tell you in general is that a lot of companies will insist on confidentiality if they pay out a lot of money. They don't want the public to know how much money they're paying out to settle a claim, so they insist on confidentiality. So in this case involving the Sound Transit bus case, we were required to sign a confidentiality agreement, so I cannot disclose the amount of the settlement.
Fascinating information, Chris, as always, and that wraps up this episode of the True Claims Podcast. We like breaking down these cases so that you understand the law better than you already do. I learned something today. I hope you did too. I'm Eric Johnson. We'll see you next time. Eric Johnson here. I spent the last 30 years reporting on what you need to know, and now I've got something I think everyone could use. The Washington Accident Book Series offers a free legal guidebook on everything from car crashes to dog bites, so that you know what to expect after any kind of accident. Know your rights and how to avoid common mistakes after an accident by getting your free copy at WashingtonAccidentBooks.com.